You just can't give in, can you? You owe it to yourself and to your family to keep fighting, don't you? And when you get knocked down, get up and stand there again and then have another go at you. You've got to have something, haven't you? I mean, just because we worked at that mill all them years ago doesn't mean to say we can't fight back, is it? So... And that's the sort of people mill workers are around here. They all fight back. Well, they try to do, you know, but when you're dead you can't, can you? So you might as well struggle on while you're alive. Do your fighting then. So, just have to keep going on and putting up with it, the pain and everything.
That was Alice Jefferson, who you may remember was one of the cancer victims who appeared last week in the programme about asbestos that was named after her, Alice, A Fight for Life. That documentary was fiercely critical of the asbestos industry. It's provoked anxious controversy. Last week there were strikes by workers as their unions demanded an urgent inquiry into the allegations made by the programme. This afternoon the matter was raised in the House of Commons. Tonight, in front of some of the people directly involved, as managers or workers in the industry, and families affected by asbestos disease, we're discussing the questions arising from the programme. Wilfred Newton and Norman Rhodes represent the biggest asbestos company in Britain. Mr. Newton, your company was severely criticised in the programme, the charge being essentially, and I summarise, that asbestos is dangerous, that your workers are at risk of contracting serious disease, including cancer, that you've known this for years, and yet that you've suppressed the relevant evidence and misled your workers about the dangers they face. You will agree that those are serious allegations.
They're very serious allegations indeed. First of all, let me make it absolutely clear, we have never underplayed the dangers of asbestos either to our workers, to the public at large, to the government or to anyone else. We are fully conscious of the dangers. We have sought for over 50 years to progressively improve conditions in our factories. I will ask Mr. Rhodes a little later to tell you about those conditions. The programme alleged that we had either supplied false or misleading or inaccurate information and that we had suppressed other information. We have never done that. We have been unable to reconcile completely our figures with those provided by Yorkshire Television in the programme, but Yorkshire Television has not given us the background and substantiation for the figures that they showed. Therefore, we were somewhat hampered. We are, however, satisfied that the figures we have given were accurate. We are completely open with our unions. We are open with the Health and Safety Executive, with the Government's Advisory Commission on Asbestos, at all times, and that is our clear policy and continues to be so. We were accused of causing a report to be suppressed. The particular report that was featured in the film was sent by Turner & Newell to the Government's Advisory Committee on Asbestos, and we have their acknowledgement. It went to all the medical advisors to the Advisory Committee. We were accused of having withheld 4 pages of evidence from the first draft of our submission. That is not true either. Those 4 pages were included in detail in the blue book that was printed by the Committee of Inquiry, and we can demonstrate that line by line, point by point.
Can I pick up what was perhaps one of the central accusations, which was indeed the suppression of evidence that you've been talking about? The programme said that in 1977 you informed a government inquiry, in effect that the risk of people contracting lung damage was less than 1% in your factory, whereas the evidence available to you apparently at the time from your own factories suggested that in fact the risk was between 17 and 20%. Now, you're not saying that you made that clear to the inquiry.
All the figures that we provided were absolutely accurate. On the detail of the particular figures you're talking about, I think Mr. Rhodes could...
Well, let me put the question precisely then. The gap is that in this inquiry you said 1% risk and other evidence, apparently not received by the inquiry, certainly not published by them, suggested between 17 and 20% risk, which is, of course, very, very much higher.
Yeah, no, I think this again is a misinterpretation of the figures. What information we did supply was supplied through Mr. Pito, the statistician, and in fact that shows that it is more than 1%. We accepted that.
17 and 20
Not
to 20%?
17 and 20%, no. This is the information that Dr. Morris put together, and in essence it was almost experimental information at the time. He was attempting to diagnose the absolute first signs of any onset of change in lung characteristics.
You respect, am I right, the British Occupational Hygiene Society?
Right.
And I'm also right, I think, that they endorsed your doctor's findings of 17 to 20%.
Now when you say endorsed, they accepted the paper. The paper has not been published. That means, as far as I'm concerned, as a layman, that the technique that was used was not accepted as
I
yet.
think neither Mr. Rhodes nor I are medical experts. The figures you're talking about were those figures that were contained in Dr. Morris's report. As I made clear a minute ago, Dr. Morris's report was sent by Turner Newell to the Advisory Committee on Asbestos. Copies were distributed to every member of the medical panel to that advisory committee. The BOHS has had the figures as well. I'm not competent to express medical opinions, and I wouldn't presume to do so.
Mr. Rhodes, if I could just continue this thought with you. A lot of the evidence came from the factory where you are now based. We now have Oxford University Cancer Unit predicting that at the present levels of exposure, up to or even above 1 in 10 people working for a long time in your factory are liable to die as a consequence of this exposure to asbestos. Now, that is an alarming risk, is it not? The kind of risk to be minimised.
It is indeed. But let me put the record straight. That prediction is made on the basis of past information, past conditions in our company. This subject of asbestos is being judged on, unfortunately, the conditions which existed many years ago. We accept that what we know now, with the benefit of hindsight, they should have been better. But what we do say now, and if we take the government report, is that if we operate, and we do operate, at the recommended standard, then the risk to our workers is absolute minimal.
We, I'm sure, will return to this in a moment. If I could just come back a moment to you, Mr. Newton, on the question of giving information about this to your workers. One of your pamphlets that was quoted talks about handling asbestos is like cooking with gas. Now, were that the case, wouldn't we in fact all be getting rid of our gas cookers? Because it's obviously not like cooking with gas, is it?
It's not a bad analogy. Everyone knows that using gas is dangerous unless you're careful. If you leave the gas tap on and you, some minutes later, light a match, you're going to be in trouble. When you are using asbestos, and we impress this on our employees constantly, you have to constantly take care. You have to observe good housekeeping practices. The employees have to be aware of this. And we believe our employees are.
Do you tell them about cancer?
We tell them about all the diseases.
What do you tell them about, for instance, the risk of cancer? Because they seem remarkably ignorant in the film interviews about what those risks were.
There are 3 diseases. And asbestosis, there is mesothelioma, and there is lung cancer. We tell them about all 3, and we explain to them that those people who smoke cigarettes greatly increase the risk of lung cancer. And it is it's synergistic, to use the jargon, with exposure to asbestos. A smoker runs a greatly enhanced risk, and we do urge our employees not to smoke.
One more point, another of the accusations, which was essentially, I suppose, a moral accusation, which suggested that one of the men who got enough to pay for a headstone, another person got £200 in compensation. That kind of handout from you hardly squares, was the accusation, with a company that claims to believe that people are our most important resource.
As far as compensation is concerned, this is a very, very complex subject that I think we could have 10 debates just on that.
What about the moral question of £200 or £100 for a headstone? Doesn't that sit uneasily with your proclamations about your concern for your workers?
As far as the £200 is concerned, the lady in question did get an ex gratia payment of £200 plus a pension. That pension supplement, I should say, was a supplement to other benefits she was receiving. We are ready to investigate any case if we're given specific details. As far as the £100 is concerned, that too was an ex gratia. Obviously, one can point fingers at all sorts of things. We believe, taken in the round, our record on compensation, our record of caring for our people, stands comparison with any company in this country, indeed with any company in the world.
John Willis, you were the producer of the programme, the pointer of the finger. You're not, it appears, accused of bad faith, but simply of getting fundamental things quite wrong, of being ignorant about the reality. And there were a lot of charges in what was said, but principally that the evidence was not suppressed, and your principal charge was that key evidence was suppressed.
I think there's two basic points from what Turner and Newell said. I think it's laughable, the idea that their workers are fully informed about the hazard of asbestos. I've talked to workers streaming out of the factory. Not one single worker knew what mesothelioma cancer was. In 1978, they told their workers that the risk of lung cancer was the same as in the general population. Yet the year before that, 1977, Julian Peto and Oxford University's cancer unit and their own company doctor had come up with the figures that the lung cancer rate was 1.9, nearly twice the national average. So I don't think the workers really know the risk. The question of suppression of evidence and information. They talked about handing the evidence on to Julian Peto. Now, we've had a letter from Julian Peto. We sent our evidence to Julian.
I didn't say we handed it to Julian Peto.
Well, you
I
said
sent the information to the Advisory Committee on Asbestos, to the Secretary of the Advisory Committee on Asbestos, who then asked if he could distribute it to all the medical advisors, and we told him, yes, of course.
Well, Julian Peto at Oxford University's cancer unit didn't know of this paper. He was astonished, he said when we showed him the paper, that the lung damage was between 17 and 20 workers out of 100, rather than 1 in 100 as Turner suggested to the committee. All Dr. Morris's findings, which suggested this figure, were looked at. The X-rays were looked at by 2 other Turner's doctors. They were looked at by the British Occupational Hygiene Society. This was years ago. It's never been published, and you know, I think it's...
Are you, regardless of whether you did the right thing or not, I suppose the central question is, are you now willing to contemplate the fact that it is something approaching the order of 17 to 20% risk?
If we have to accept what good, well-advised medical opinion tells us after they have examined the facts and after they've completed their research, we wouldn't presume to make the medical judgments. We depend upon the medical profession for this.
David G., given that, are you at all reassured by what you've heard from Turner and Newell?
Not at all, really. Let's take one point. The company said that we're perfectly open with the unions. In the questionnaire that we sent you, and which was figured on the programme, we asked questions about lung cancer, numbers of cases. We asked that question because as early as 1955, your workers there had provided the first evidence that linked asbestos with excess lung cancers. In the reply, you said, irrelevant, out of context. You gave no information whatsoever on lung cancer. And then you turned to the publication that you'd given to the shop stewards in '78 and found that you were saying that the lung cancer excess was, there wasn't one, that the cancer rate was the same as the national population. And I just wonder why you've been burying the whole question of the lung cancer problem and hiding it from our membership. And have you, for example, told them that now the rate seems to be higher amongst those exposed later, i.e. in the years when conditions are supposed to be improving, i.e. after 1951, which is the latest we can go to with such a long latent period for cancer. But in the post-1951 group, the excess lung cancer rate amongst those workers in Rochdale is now 2.6 times. It was 2.1 times in the earlier group. So things are getting worse on the lung cancer side. Why are you hiding this information both from me and the people at the shop floor?
Can I reply to that? We're not hiding the information at all.
Why did you say the question was irrelevant? A question about lung cancer and asbestos? Known about since 35, proved in 55.
It is not irrelevant.
That's what you said on your questionnaire to me. No figures were given.
The figures that you were given really is the Peto study.
You didn't give me any figures.
No, but sorry.
Let's deal with the point of the relevance or not.
You were aware of these, and that is the best study that we've had in our factory with regard to lung cancer. And furthermore, may I add, figure that was disputed in the reply to you was something to do with asbestosis. The claim was made, we had said 20, Yorkshire Television had found 81, I think the number was. In fact, that again is an interpretation of how you receive the information. The 20 were 20 people after 1950.
Can I?
No, may I finish,
Yes.
please?
We found 81 since.
No, if I can come back to this. The 81 you're referring to relates to people who were exposed prior to 1950. We've given the number on that, please. We've given the number on that, and if you add the total number together, there is no difference in our figures.
Mr.
But
Dimbleby,
the question
if
was
I
quite
may.
clear.
Hang on a
It said,
sec,
it said numbers diagnosed between 1950 and 1979. You gave the impression that the rate of asbestosis was falling down to 20. We found 81 diagnosed. The question was quite clear, and you didn't answer it correctly. It's as
Sorry,
simple as that.
I'm going to
wasn't
cut. I'm going to
diagnosed.
cut
That's
across.
what it
If
said
I,
in the question.
I'm
I
going
haven't got it, the question.
Hang on a second. I'm going to ask Dr. Murray. Your name is recommended by Cape Industries, who in fact employed Alice, who we saw in the film, as someone with expertise. Now, with your expertise, Doctor, are you not alarmed by, regardless of who was right or wrong, although that is clearly crucial when one comes to an understanding of who one should believe, are you not disturbed by these figures of 17 to 20% risk?
I'm not alarmed because I haven't seen these figures. What I would like to do is to look at the figures myself and make up my own mind and not listen to other people's interpretations.
Would it be your view that a cancer unit at Oxford University is something to be taken pretty seriously when it suggests that kind of figure is relevant?
I know Sir Richard Dall and Julian Peto, and they're very competent people, but I haven't seen them write down this particular figure.
Well, if I can help here, I think as you are fairly closely attached to the British Occupational Hygiene Society. In fact, you were president at the time when that august body produced the old 2-fibre limit. Now, that has been shown to have been wrong by many, many times, principally because, apart from anything else, it completely ignored the cancer risk. How any Occupational Hygiene Society can try and come up with a limit which is supposed to protect workers, ignoring cancer some 20 years or so after it's been discovered, I just don't know. And secondly, of course, I mean, you were part of the medical inspectorate responsible for the Hebden Bridge affair, which was criticised by the Ombudsman. The whole factory department was criticised, and you were part of it at the time. So I think that many of us on the trade union side haven't got that much confidence in many doctors, and I'm afraid you're one of them.
Well, this is very interesting because I was medical inspector of factories in 1947. Until 1956, I visited Rochdale, Hebden Bridge, Cleckheaton, and many other asbestos factories in between. From 1956 to 61, I was working for the International Labour Office in Geneva, and from 61 to 74, I was medical advisor to the TUC. And I didn't pull any punches in discussing with the TUC in their training college, as David G. well knows, the effects of asbestos. And I have never disguised the dangers of asbestos.
Dr. Murray, I think you're on record as saying that conditions were good in Cape's factory where Alice worked in the 1950s. I, as an inspector, was taken there in 1960 to see a model asbestos factory. It wasn't. I was conned then as an inspector by the asbestos industry and by the medical inspectors, and I've spoken to other factory inspectors who felt the same. And I think we're being conned by the asbestos industry now. From a medical point of view, if you want zero asbestos cancer risk, you want zero asbestos.
Are you saying, Mr. Rushworth, that the case that the film identified can be generalised throughout the asbestos industry?
I think it can. There's a history there of cover-ups. Let's not get bogged down in statistics. So I deal with people now, people like Alice.
And so do
and
I.
I deal with several of them. And to me, the people are not statistics.
Can I say something about the history?
My co-director Nancy Tate's dealt with hundreds in these past few years. And at the present time, I think there are thousands of asbestos cancer victims like Alice right now in Britain.
Wilfred Newton, you said that was outrageous.
For Mr. Rushworth to claim that the asbestos industry, and Turner and Newell in particular, because I can talk for Turner and Newell, is conning the unions and conning everybody, that we are pretending the conditions in our factory are better than they are, is nonsense. Asbestos is probably...
Hang on, let him finish the point.
Asbestos is probably the most researched industrial mineral in general use.
and the most dangerous.
We acknowledge that it is dangerous. We acknowledge that in the past things have not been as good as they should have been. We acknowledge that there is still room for improvement, and we're working desperately hard at that improvement. But to claim that we have been conning everybody really is monstrous.
Given the evidence of the film, Mr. Newton, do you still believe that the level of risk is what I think you've called in the past defined as socially acceptable?
We believe that at the present concentrations in our factories, and remember that we don't comply just with the 2-fibre standard now, we comply with the standard that was recommended by the Advisory Committee on Asbestos, and we deplore the fact that that has not yet been legislated because of delays in the EEC. But nevertheless, that is the standard we adopt within our plants. We believe that the risk at that level has been reduced to low levels. We would not claim that all risk is eliminated.
If we were recognising the asbestos cancer victims and helping them, you could perhaps start talking about socially acceptable risk. But how on earth can you talk to Alice's dependents now and say, I'm sorry, her death and the thousands of deaths that are going on now were socially acceptable?
I don't regard those deaths as socially acceptable at all.
The criminal negligence claims that are being succeeded now are accepting negligence by the asbestos industry in the past, and there is still negligence by the asbestos industry and its users.
Neither I nor any one of my colleagues regards the death of Alice or of any other individual as socially acceptable.
Why do you get no money for a headstone then? Why is the compensation so inadequate?
Can we stop that point there, because I think it's important to move on for the sake of people who are watching. Just hang on, please, a second. David G., I mean, one of the workers, one of your members, I assume, in that programme, said that if it were a choice of his job or death, he would prefer the factory to be closed down. Now, what do you want to happen now? What is the next step?
Well, I think the last thing that we want is for the whole asbestos industry to be wound up tomorrow, because that would cause a great deal of social unrest and a great deal of unemployment and misery, probably equal to deaths, although who am I to compare misery and deaths and so on. I think at the end of the day, the people who take the risks are the ones who have to decide where they're going to strike their balance. The job of people like me is to help them to strike a better balance between jobs and health. If society were organised differently, we wouldn't force people into making these horrible decisions quite so often.
Do you want government action or
we do want government action. We want, for example, firstly a select committee inquiry into exactly what the risks are to both the workers and the public, because the public is at risk from the cancer hazard from quite low levels. And secondly, we want it to get hold of all the information that seems not to have been adequately taken on board by that medical advisory committee. I think the British Occupational Hygiene Society's study, for example, which they said was substantial new evidence, never got in a completed form to the medical committee.
Would you be glad to cooperate in a parliamentary
commission? We would very happily cooperate and give our full cooperation, as we have done for 50 years and more, to any new inquiry. Turner and Newall has led the research into the problems associated with cancer and other diseases associated with asbestos. We fund cancer research in this country to a considerable extent every year. We will very happily cooperate with any further inquiry. We want to continuously make things better. We've been doing it for 50 years and we intend to continue.
If that's the case, why have you suggested in so much of your public information that things are all right?
I don't think we have ever said that things are all right. We have always pointed that there are dangers, that working with asbestos has to be carefully and properly controlled by substantial investment. The programme mentioned thousands. In fact, it's millions of pounds.
Would you then welcome a new inquiry now?
I would welcome an inquiry, and we would cooperate with it to the hilt.
Yeah. One other important aspect is you said you're open with the workers. We've talked about Alice and the victims, but in Rochdale you adopt a hole-in-the-corner attitude towards compensation. The second major question I asked on my questionnaire was, how many cases of people have you had that have been certified asbestosis, have received EHSS benefits, or that have received compensation from you as victims? That whole area of questions was called confidential between you and individuals. Now, I think that the question of compensation is not an individual matter, because of course with your authority and power you can go to a little widow in a back street of Rochdale and say, we're going to look after you and here's a small pension and here's £200. She's bound to feel as though you're doing a good job. The whole thing on compensation should be negotiated properly with the trade unions. It's not an individual matter. People can't assess whether they're getting a good deal, as on wages, unless they know what everybody else is getting. Now, I would like you to publicly commit yourself to doing
Can I just say something
to a
about
proper
compensation,
scheme of
please?
compensation for victims, negotiated properly with the trade unions in an above-the-board manner, instead of in the hole-in-the-corner attitude that you've adopted.
Norman
Will you do
Rhodes,
that?
briefly.
Can I say
Will you
I'd like
do
to say
that?
two things. One on compensation and one about lung cancer that we've been
Briefly,
talking about.
if you would.
Very briefly. Compensation, people who we know have contracted the disease, we make up their wages to their normal earnings as long as they work with us and as long as they are through to retirement. We have people 80 years old who are receiving full
I'm going
compensation.
to, I'm afraid, unless you can make your point extremely quickly.
Right.
Say
Very
yes
quickly,
to my question.
very quickly, on the question of this programme, nearly every case we saw was mesothelioma. That is to do with blue asbestos primarily.
Rubbish.
That factory at Hebden
Lung cancer
was in blue.
our main problem.
We
There's-
do not
there's-
handle blue. We never have
I'm
since
not competent to-
1 in
1969.
10 of your workers have died of mesothelioma since 1930. 1 in 10
They
long-term
have not.
workers since 1930. That's
I'm
not true.
sorry,
Julian
that
Peter at Oxford University says that.
that is the point
That's
amongst
not a valid point.
that is the point amongst mutual cries of rubbish where we have to stop.
I would-
One thing, I'm sorry,
May I issue one invitation?
yes.
Would Mr. Willis like to come to my office and spend a day, if he wishes, going over his figures with our figures and discussing the whole issue?
I would like to.
Yes or no,
Well,
I think is all we
we've
have
got
time
to give our
for.
figures to the if there's a parliamentary inquiry, that's who we give our figures to first. Well, then we'll talk to Turner and Newell's later.
Right. No, I'm sorry. At that point, I really do have to stop. I know this conversation is going to go on. We've had one only area of agreement, which is that an inquiry would be worthwhile and that you would cooperate in that inquiry. It is very clear that the issue of asbestos and the dangers that it poses are now a matter of major concern. Good night.
That hill. I never used to notice that as a hill. Did you?
No.
Well, I used to be able to do right onto traffic lights there, didn't I? When I first came.
Yeah.
I should be able to get back to it. I could just get up to the zebra as my goal, eventually.